This is the Sydney suburb of Redfern. But we could be in parts of Waterloo, Paddington, Surrey Hills, Erskineville or Camperdown, Rozelle, Balmain or Glebe. Almost anywhere within a 3-mile radius of the city centre, behind the slick facade of the commercial centres and the floating grime of the factories, lie streets like these. They were the first areas to absorb the flood of new settlers as the early Sydney began to grow. Now people are beginning to move, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes hopefully. These are the Fitzpatrick children. They live in Moorhead Street, Redfern. And here in the backyard of their home, the two girls amuse themselves in the only playground they have. The children have been playing here ever since they were born. But this is the last time for the Fitzpatricks are moving from Redfern. The New South Wales Housing Commission has bought this house and it's to be demolished as part of a huge redevelopment program. Almost £2 million have been spent in buying and wrecking the worst of the festering jungle of timber and masonry that belongs to the past. Mrs. Fitzpatrick came to live in Redfern from a country town when she was married 4 years ago. It was difficult for the young couple to find a house in overcrowded Sydney, and they were glad enough to settle in Redfern, even though they had to share their home for some years. The Moorhead Street house had no garden, only the high-walled yard, and whenever Mrs. Fitzpatrick wanted to look beyond the 4 walls, this is what she saw. For the Fitzpatricks, it will be a fast-fading memory. They face a new life in a new suburb, far from the city. They're just one of the 1,000 families moved from the inner city area since the slum clearance program began 11 years ago. The house they've left behind becomes a relic telling the story of a past era. The pattern of the new housing settlements is typified at 7 Hills on the outskirts of the city. And it's here that the Fitzpatricks have been provided with a new brick home by the Housing Commission. More than 2,000 families have been housed in this settlement, which is the largest of its kind in New South Wales. Industries have been set up, and Mr. Fitzpatrick, who's a painter by trade, expects to have no trouble finding a job here. The Housing Commission has found that there's usually 2 houses needed to replace every one knocked down in the overcrowded slum areas. For the Fitzpatrick family, 7 Hills will mean an entirely different way of life. And just as big a change is planned for the site of their old home. The demolition team began work as soon as the house was empty. Blocks of Housing Commission flats like these are to be built in Moorhead Street, and for Devonshire Street, Surrey Hills, the most advanced project yet is planned. The Minister for Housing, Mr. Lander, is asked about it.
Mr. Land, I wonder if you'd explain the detail of this building for us.
Well, the details are rather involved, but this building is a set of 3 buildings, actually, and will be built like the letter Y.
How long do you think it will be before we might see this building on this site, Mr. Lander?
To be on the safe side, I would say before the whole building is complete, it will take the best part of the 2 years.
In other words, you hope to have some 1,200 people living here within 2 years.
Oh, well, of course, as you see, there are plenty of people living in the blocks of 3 stories that are already here, but there will be 1,200 at least additional people on this site when the building is completed. And they will have, of course, as you know, the amenities of all these places around here, such as their schools and hospitals and churches, and all the facilities that they would not have if we moved them to outer suburbs. As you can see, in the nearby area of this locality, there are a lot of slums all in existence which will, in the course of time, be pulled down. The government has already embarked on a slum clearance plan, which has demolished many of the eyesores of Sydney in this suburb and in Redfern. There is much to be done, however, and I am hopeful that before long we will pull down more of the existing slums and erect in its place some of the magnificent modern buildings which we can see before us already erected on this site, and those which are about to be erected in the very near future. The block of flats to be erected on this block of land will be very much like a lot of apartment houses I saw in Stockholm, Sweden. It will be very beautiful indeed. And when one realizes that on this very large block of ground there were dozens of slums of the worst type, one can see what a great improvement will be made in this particular area.